it's my pleasure, everybody, to introduce you to Professor Carolyn Seaman. Caroline is a professor in the Information Systems Department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and she is interim director of the Center for Women in Technology. And her research involves empirical studies of software engineering with particular emphasis on maintenance, organizational structure, communication measurement, COTS-based development, and qualitative research methods. And I know that her focus recently has been a lot on technical debt, which is a really important topic. We've touched on that a little bit throughout the term. And I just wanted to say that you're actually more famous, I think, in our research community, or super famous in our research community for your work on qualitative research methods. And she's blushing right now, but she really is known as the person that brought qualitative research methods into software engineering and transformed a lot the way that we do research in software engineering. And for that, I'm really grateful to you, Caroline. And you've given excellent tutorials on that topic, and I've actually posted a link to one of those on our course website, and I've encouraged the students and the participants in this class to look at those. So for today, we read your paper on, what was it called again? The War Stories paper. Have it here in front of me. Revealing actual documentation usage in software maintenance through war stories. And I was fascinated with this paper because, first of all, because of the topic that it covers. So documentation is, of course, a really important topic. And we haven't talked about it a great deal, but it fits in our theme today for collaboration, coordination, and knowledge flow. And also because of the research method of telling war stories, which was not really something that we had talked about so far. So I thought that that would be super cool to include today. So we all read your paper, and the course participants have been very busy over the last couple of days adding some questions, and I shared a link of the questions with you. So we've kind of loosely grouped them, and I thought we would give all of them a chance to ask you some of those questions and to meet you here today. So let me start with, and I said I would cue people in the chat, which I will do. So let me start with Cassie, if that's okay. If you would like to ask your question. So the first few questions that we're going to ask are about improving documentation. So related to the topic. So Cassie, are you there today? Yes, I can. Okay, so I'll jump in and ask this one. So Cassie asks, you state an overarching conclusion from this set of findings is that there is a need in industry for more organized ways of making documentation available to maintainers in a painless and flexible way. This was a quote from your paper. And Cassie was wondering, do you have any possible ideas on how to make documentation easily available to maintainers?
So this is an example of how dated this paper is in terms of technology. So you'll notice the date is 2007, which was a lifetime ago. Just for comparison, that was before GitHub, was before even Google Drive. So there was nothing like that. Hyperlinks were still the hot new thing. So really what we were suggesting was anything to help people find documentation. There weren't good search tools. So it would be interesting to update that part of this study now, where developers have all kinds of tools, and these tools are widespread. And I'd be curious if maintenance environments like the ones that we studied in 2007, or really 2006 and 2005, if maintenance environments like that are using tools that have come into being since then to manage their documentation, and how they're using them. And I don't know, but the fact is that addressing that problem is much easier now than it was in 2007. And there are lots of different ways that it could be using. I mean, even just using Google Drive would be a huge improvement over what most folks were doing in 2007.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, all of the social tools have kind of appeared really on the scene. Actually, in 2007, that was when a lot of them, like Stack Overflow, I think, was 2007, as well as GitHub. Backing up a little bit before we dig into some of the questions, I just wanted to ask you a little bit, like, how did you actually get into doing qualitative research? Like, what was your introduction to that? I should have opened with that.
Well, that's a story. So I was a PhD student. I was working with Victor Basili at the University of Maryland. And Vic Basile was big into empirical software engineering. He's kind of the father of empirical software engineering. But empirical software engineering at that time was very quantitative. And so all of his students were learning our quantitative research methods, as was I. But the research question, the research area that I really wanted to look at was communication and coordination among people in a software team. So, and what makes communication more efficient or less efficient, or less effective or more effective. And I was really, really struggling with coming up with metrics for that, ways to measure that quantitatively. And I was really struggling with that. And Vic was struggling with it too. So he went off, as he often did, to be the external thesis committee person for somebody, I think it was in Syracuse, actually. And he went to the student's dissertation or defense, and he came back all excited and he said, "Carolyn, have you ever heard of qualitative methods?" And I said, "Vic, no, I haven't. What are they?" The student that he had gone to the defense for was from a business school, but was doing things related to software engineering, which was why he was asked to be the external person. So he said, "I really don't completely understand it, but look it up and start reading." And so I did. And sort of qualitative methods are decades, if not more, old in other disciplines. So there was a wealth of things to read. If I could get through, I don't have a lot of background in things like sociology and psychology and education research and anthropology, which is where this reading came from. So it was a bit of a job to work through it, but eventually I got to the research methods part of it. And I thought, yes, this is what I need to study communication and coordination in software teams. So I did. I designed a study. It was mixed methods. I was still in a computer science department. There still needed to be some numbers. So I managed to find some things to measure, but the data that I collected mostly was qualitative. And I sort of taught myself how to code and how to do the analysis. So that's how it started.
Wow. And you haven't stopped since.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that.
So in your article, Caroline, you wrote, there are times when official or informal documentation, a developer's personal notes, emails, etc., becomes the saving factor when facing a difficult maintenance tasks. Would you say that this is the key value of storytelling? I guess that you could pull that out. And what sort of standard would you use to ensure simplicity and clarity of documentation? And what would you use to replace the need for it?
Yeah. So, so yes, I think this is a key value of storytelling. I really think that a lot of these really interesting tidbits, especially about people, and that was a lot of the findings that we reported in this paper were about the human role in information gathering and maintenance. And I really don't think we would have gotten a lot of that without having sort of a storytelling framework for our interviews. So yeah, I think that is a key value. As in terms of creating a standard to ensure simplicity and clarity and to sort of to make documentation more clear, which is a good thing to do, but I'm not sure that would really replace the people part of it. I mean, the big challenge of documentation is you don't really know what information people are going to need. The future readers of your documentation are going to need, and there's always going to be something that comes up that you just never thought to put in the documentation. And that's where humans come in. Now, you can reduce that as much as possible. And there are lots of standards now for writing different types of documentation that attempt to be exhaustive, which is why nobody follows the standards, because they're enormous. And the point of them is to help you put everything possible in the documentation, and nobody has time for that. So documentation standards tend not to be used because they're sort of unrealistic. So no, I don't think a standard or a guideline for clarity. Maybe clarity is important, and simplicity, but a lot of the standards sort of try to ensure completeness of documentation. And I think it's important to try, but it's a little bit of an unattainable goal. And I don't think you can eliminate the future need for having people.
Yeah. And a bit related to that, Jory was wondering about another example of a barrier you gave in your paper was the maintenance group who made their documentation largely unavailable to the new group that, taking over the maintenance task. And so Jory was wondering, would you recommend a centralized repository of documentation for teams or departments, or some sort of knowledge transfer practice?
Definitely, definitely. So this was in a context where there was a very bad transition of the project from one contractor to another. So this was a large US government agency who did all their software development through contractors, which was the norm then and still is, as far as I know. And the agency, for whatever reason, very abruptly took the contract away from one contractor and gave it to another. So the first contractor was upset, and they did what they could to make it as difficult as possible for the new contractor to come in. And this is one of the things they did, was they kept hold of their documentation. So certainly if there had been a centralized repository that the first contractor had been required to put all their documentation in that repository, and if that repository were under the control of the government agency, that would have solved this problem. That was not the case. And this sort of touches on, and we didn't get enough data to really explore this, but knowledge is power, information is power, and some organizations really understand that well. So this is a case where the documentation was sort of weaponized. It was a valuable asset that the first contractor was not willing to give up because they knew it had value. And so they tried to extract a price. It didn't work, but that happens sometimes. So a centralized repository would be great if the first contractor would have agreed to that. But in this case, I think that they would not have. So this is a little less about documentation and more about power. Power and money.
And people, right?
People, not about people.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of us, when we do research, we kind of assume that humans are rational human beings, rational beings, and that they're going to behave in the best way that they can, in the interest for the project and other people, but they don't, right? So I think that's one of the cool things about this method, right, is that you were able to pull that out, right, from using that method. Yeah. Jordan, let's bring you into the conversation, and you can ask your message.
Hi. Yeah.
Or question.
I did have a question. It was for new employees or new maintainers joining organizations. Do you see even more barriers with documentation usage when it seems like connections to the developers or the builders or through word of mouth is critical for gathering information?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good observation. Yes, it is harder for new people. So the study that this paper describes was an ongoing study, and we reported, I believe, if I'm remembering right, reported results only from the first site that we did these interviews at, which happened, as I said, was a large government organization who at the time, and still is, has a fairly aging workforce. I think it was about 5 years after this, I was involved in another project, basically a knowledge harvesting project at this government agency, who was realizing that the bulk of their organizational knowledge was retiring in the next few years. So this was definitely an older workforce, older group of maintainers who had been working together for a long time, had been working in that organization for a long time, had a lot of contacts, relied a lot on their personal contacts. And yes, that's a huge barrier then for new people coming in, which makes some of the newer tools, as we mentioned before, the searchable repositories that are available now, so much more valuable and so much more important. So yeah, that's an interesting insight.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. We'll pivot a little bit from this topic and switch to a little bit about need for documentation today with remote work. And so for that, I'll bring in Alessandra.
Yeah, hello. So the documentation seems to be even more important nowadays since we are working remotely. and the access to our coworkers as the human source of the information may be difficult. So compared with the convenience of an in-person or shared location. So as you just mentioned, there are guidelines to keep extensive documentation, but how to find this balance? Which practical guidelines or reference can be suggested to project teams to follow to build this minimum documentation required for effective information sharing?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it's very organization specific, and I'm not sure it's off the top of my head. This is not something I've thought deeply about, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure that it's so different when people are working remotely, because still, this was not so much true in 2007, but now, paper documentation is not very common. So even if you were sitting in an office next to somebody else, you'd still, you'd walk over to their office and ask them for some sort of piece of documentation, and likely they'd send you a link or they'd send you an electronic document. I think it's far more rare now for somebody to turn around in their office chair and take something off their bookshelf and hand it to you. So that can happen the same way remotely, except instead of walking over to their office, you're shooting them a message or an email or something. But I think documentation, I don't know this for sure, but my assumption would be that documentation is far more likely to be electronic. And so as long as the documentation is electronic, then passing it around from one person to another doesn't really matter where those people are physically located. So, the electronic, being able to electronically search and retrieve documents is just as important. And, those would be the major considerations in either case for building a repository of documentation.
Great, thanks, Alessandra, for that question. Very topical, right, today. We'll switch a little bit to some of the questions about research methods, because there were a lot about the research method that you're using about storytelling. And quite a few of these were about sort of the limitations of the threats, which we've talked about quite a bit in the course. So I'm going to start with Matt to ask his question about the research method, the storytelling method.
Hi, yeah, I had a question. So your paper kind of compared storytelling methods to structured and semi-structured interviews. I saw sort of a similarity to field study methods, and I was wondering how they compare, or how storytelling compares that way, and how the validity threats line up, and could those two methods are they good candidates for triangulation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's true. You mean field studies, sort of field observation along with storytelling, that those two things together would be a nice mix in terms of triangulation. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be a very nice mix. If you had that kind of access. Yeah, I mean, we mentioned in the paper that we really like to do the storytelling interviews in place, that we didn't take our interviewees somewhere else to interview them. We interviewed them in the place where they do their work, which means any kind of interview that you do in someone's office or in someone's workplace has an element of observation in it, usually, because you're kind of looking around at what they have around them. They often pull what we call props. They'll pick up a book, or they'll pick up a picture, or they'll show you something on their computer. So there's often stuff to look at anytime you're interviewing in someone's workplace. So that's a real advantage. And I think for storytelling, that happens even more, because they're telling a story, and some people who really enjoy storytelling, they like to use props, and they like to show you stuff and bring sort of a dramatic element into it. So they can do that when they're in their own space. So there is a little bit of a flavor of a field observation when you're doing these types of interviews in place. And if you do them along with observations, the stories then often become the backstory to what you observed. I did this a little bit. I didn't call it storytelling back then, but for my dissertation, my main data collection was observing meetings, observing code inspection meetings in particular. But what I usually did is I observed a code inspection meeting, and then I had short interviews with some of the people that were in the meeting. And what I often got in those follow-up interviews was the backstory. Well, this is why so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that, and this is why this seems so important to that person. And it was sort of a little mini storytelling type of interview, although I hadn't really intended it that way. So, but it dovetailed really nicely because that really helped me to interpret what I was observing. So I think that actually is a very nice combination. I think you're right, you're onto something there.
Well, thanks.
As far as similar validity threats and limitations, that's probably true. I don't know about the Hawthorne effect, because I think in storytelling interviews, there's less of a sense that somebody's being studied, because you really give the interviewee complete control over what they tell you. So that sense of being judged or being tested is really, really diminished with a storytelling interview, much less than a more structured interview where you're asking specific questions, and where a lot of some people in more structured interviews feel judged and feel tested, which will make them more likely to change what they're going to say to fit what they think you're looking for. In a storytelling interview, they have no idea what you're looking for, which is one advantage.
Yeah, thanks. That's super cool, actually, to think about it that way. There's also some recent papers actually that question that the Hawthorne effect is a thing. Yeah, which I'll post some links to those papers in our Cool Reads channel in Slack. But I like the insight that that people aren't likely to kind of feel that pressure. On the other hand, actually, Ansh and Dave had a couple of follow-on questions to that, which I'll sort of fold into one. Ansh was wondering, sort of because storytelling is looking back in time, maybe, memories are tainted, right, over time, or maybe sometimes some aspects of the story are exaggerated or understated when compared to reality. And maybe there's issues with the, the researcher or the interviewee becoming sort of somehow, emotionally connected, to the interviewer. Like, do you think any of those introduce threats to this method?
Yeah, so the reliability in particular, when people are telling stories, you can't assume that what they're telling you is 100% accurate. And so you have to go in with that assumption. So storytelling is not a good way to get sort of a factual account of some phenomenon that you're trying to study. It's if that's what you're getting at, if there's some specific phenomenon that happened in the recent past, and you want to find out exactly what that phenomenon was and how it worked, storytelling is not the way to do it. So you really can't assume accuracy. So the point of hearing people's stories is to get insight into what's important to them, to sort of take it up a level, or depending, I'm getting my metaphors mixed up, but you're also sort of digging in a little bit to what's behind the words. So you're looking at your interviewees' emotional responses to what they're talking about. You're getting overall strategies. In particular, in this case, we were looking for strategies. What do people actually do to try to get information? And if that's what we're getting at, it doesn't really matter that they maybe have some of their facts mixed up, or maybe they're overemphasizing some aspect a little bit, because that just gives us more information about their motivations and what they feel is important, their priorities. Okay, so reliability of the data itself is not really an issue here. It's really not important, because you can't rely on that. But what has to be reliable is your analysis. Okay, so talking about your analysis methods and making sure that they're repeatable, that's important when you're doing this kind of thing. The other thing, researcher bias. Yeah, I think you can't get away from researcher bias, I think, in pretty much any study, so particularly qualitative. Like any qualitative study, you have to be very careful, and you have to be constantly questioning your own biases. And that's why I say, just like, you should never swim alone, or you should never go out drinking alone. You should never do qualitative analysis alone. Same idea. You need to have somebody there who is constantly questioning you, and you're questioning each other about where your biases are coming in. So that's true in this type of study as well.
Great. I love that. I'm going to remember that one. So one more question maybe about threats. I'll invite Dylan to ask his question. And you're muted.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, on a similar vein there, you mentioned that some participants were much more comfortable / able to tell their stories compared to others, which presumably resulted in a bit more storytelling data to pull from them. I was wondering if this could skew the coded data and results to reflect the voices of those who were more able because there was more data, or is there a way that you can control for this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. And what we didn't say in the paper, but it was definitely true, is there was a very strong correlation between those interviewees who felt more comfortable in the storytelling paradigm and those whose first language was English. So we did not control for that, and probably should have. That was not something we thought a whole lot about in 2007, I'm sorry to say. But that is definitely something that should be, as far as controlling for it, it's not like a quantitative thing where you can apply statistical methods to control for something like that, but it is something you constantly have to be questioning the data about. So one way to do that, there's several ways to do that, but one is when you are at the point where you're formulating a result. So if you're doing a grounded theory type of analysis, when you get to selective coding and you're deciding what are the most important categories, you look at the diversity of the data underneath those categories and those major propositions that you're putting forth, and you see, where does that data come from? Is it come strictly from this group of super great English speaking storytellers, or is there some other data even from the other interviewees who weren't as able to express themselves? So you kind of have to make sure that the data underlying anything you put forward as a result of the study has a diverse basis of data that supports it. Otherwise it's not a finding of your study, it's a finding of some subset of your interviewees. So yeah, being aware of that and being honest about it is important. That's a really good point. There was definitely variation in how easy it was for people to talk in stories.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A great question, Dylan. Thanks for that. We'll move to a couple of questions about challenges that you had with analyzing the data. And I'll invite Jonathan Bezo to jump in.
Hi. So my question was, in your paper, you mentioned that one of the limitations of the storytelling approach is that the interviews have to be transcribed verbatim, and that was expensive. Do you think that with the advance of text-to-speech algorithms in the last 13 years since this paper, that since they became more accurate and capable, that makes this approach more viable today than it was in 2007?
I think it is, yeah. I haven't used technology to transcribe interviews in any of my own studies. So I don't have firsthand knowledge of that. I haven't tried it yet because I don't quite trust it. I'll tell you a story from this study, actually. For some of the data from this study, we actually used a paid transcription service. So it wasn't technology, it was a person who we sent off the recordings to, and they sent us back a text document. So there was one or two of the interviews where, I guess it was just one of them, that a recurring topic was version control. So the interviewee was telling these stories about how they were doing version control and the problems that occurred with the way they were doing version control, meaning how they controlled different versions of the software. But our transcriptionist was not a software developer, was not a software engineer, and everywhere where the term version control should have appeared in the transcript. It was instead virgin control, and which caused us a lot of, we were wondering what on earth they thought we were talking about. So I suspect errors like that would be maybe even more common when you're using technology to transcribe. So the lesson is you can't rely on that 100%. You still have to read through the transcript and catch things like that. That was an obvious one because we knew we weren't talking about anything having to do with virgins in these interviews. So that was easy to catch, but other errors like that would be a lot more subtle and could slip through. So there are some validity threats around transcribing by anybody other than the people who did the interviews. So, but the efficiency gain is huge. It's huge. So, and as the technology gets better, that validity threat reduces. Yes.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, for that question. All right, so next question, I'm going to jump to more about using this method. And I'm going to invite Rohit Pudari to ask this question because I'm actually super curious about what the answer is to this because I never would have thought of it. Rohit, are you there?
Yeah. So my question was, the storytelling approach described in the paper is used on interviews. Can it be used for service as well? And what factors would be a challenge if we try doing it?
Yeah. So yes, you could. So I guess the way you would do that is there would be a survey question that asks people to tell a story and ask them to either write the story, I guess, or record them telling the story. And yes, I guess you could do that. The disadvantage is then you're not there to ask follow-up questions and ask probes to get more information. And if you're asking people to write it, they might write less and write less detail. That might be true with recording as well. So you get more detail if you're there to probe them to get more out of them, and if they don't have to write it down. Yeah, I guess I could. I've never done that. I've never tried it. I can't think of any studies that have done that, but it's possible. It's possible. I mean, the advantage of it is you could get a whole lot more data than if you had to do the interviews, one-on-one interviews. But I would guess the data would not be as rich, and then you'd have the problem of analyzing all that data, especially when there isn't as much detail. I would think you would get a lot of data that's difficult to interpret if people are telling stories who aren't very good at telling stories or who leave out a lot of detail. So that might make it hard.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, right? Maybe we could use something like TikTok, for people to share stories or something. I'm trying to encourage my students to use TikTok for their project presentations. We'll see what happens there. So we're getting near the end of our time. Sorry, we're going a little bit over. I hope that's okay with everybody. Derek, would you like to, they're laughing about TikTok. Okay, TikTok platform is terrible. All right, I won't force that on you. Derek, would you like to jump in with your question?
Yeah. Quick one on the transcriber thing. We tried one. It's really good when it's common language. The minute you throw anything technical in there, it just goes off the rails.
That's right.
But it can actually be it's almost there. It's a helpful tool where you just have to correct it versus writing the whole thing out. Some people love it, some hate it. It's not perfect yet.
Thanks for sharing that, Derek.
And my question was, how difficult is it to get this stuff published in the quantitative journals? Like, how often do they just kind of be like, I don't know what this is, I don't like it?
Yeah. So I don't think it's harder than getting other qualitative work to be published. I mean, getting strict 100% qualitative work published is a bit of a challenge, but it's getting easier. It's easier than it was 25 years ago when I did my dissertation. And it's what it takes is more people. I mean, for a while there, after I started publishing stuff on qualitative stuff, there just weren't many reviewers who understood anything about qualitative work, which meant that I did a lot of reviewing. but it meant that a lot of papers got rejected. And that's just gradually been getting better as more people are publishing. There are more reviewers available who understand qualitative, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, but it's getting there. As far as stuff about war stories, I don't think that it's any more difficult. There have been a few other war stories papers published since this one, I think. I'd have to do some Googling to confirm that. I know there have been some other war stories studies done, and I think they've been published. So yeah, it has the same challenges that any sort of, especially a field like a qualitative field study would have, that doesn't have any quantitative element. It's always easier. It still is easier to get something published if you've got some numbers in there. So mixed method is still sort of the safest way to go.
Yeah. And actually Nimi was asking, what do you think could be the reason for not using this method? And do you think it's because it's hard to publish, or is it because, it's hard to analyze the data, or just use it?
Well, it's also not appropriate for all research questions. Okay. So, it's good for, you want to study a phenomenon, you want to study it very, very broadly. You don't have a lot of preconceived notions about what you're going to get. And you're looking at a phenomenon that has some historical aspect to it that you want people to reflect on how this works over time. And, there's lots of things that you want to study in software engineering that don't fit that model, and that it just would not make sense to use war stories on. So I don't think war stories are ever going to be a hugely common type of research method that you'll find in software engineering. Mm-hmm. So the question of whether it's being underutilized, that's hard to say. It's not used much, but maybe it shouldn't be used much. I think it's a really good thing for certain research questions and certain stages of research, but it doesn't work for everything.
Great, thank you. We are at the end of our time. It went so fast, such a great discussion. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to sneak one more in. Rohit just messaged me and said he really wants to know if you know anything about, challenges of documentation and differences with startups. Have you seen any research with regard to documentation and startups that you could
not specifically, but I actually have a PhD student right now who is studying. Basically, they're studying technical debt in startups. And not unsurprisingly, often the technical debt in startups is related to a lack of documentation. Because documentation, in general, documentation is not high on the priority list of most software engineering organizations. And that is even more true of startups and organizations that are in the sort of the context similar to startups, very fast development times, heavy deadlines, market pressure, all that sort of thing. So inadequate documentation leads to technical debt, leads to maintenance problems, which puts more pressure on maintenance, which leads to even less priority on documentation, et cetera, et cetera. It helps that we have, again, the stuff that we didn't have in 2007, Dana, I think somebody put in the chat that Daniela Damian has a paper on that. I think that's true. Yeah. So, there's been some stuff on that. I'm not super familiar with that literature, but I think it's out there.
Yeah, Derek will post a reference to that in our Code Reads channel in Slack. Well, Caroline, thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon and sharing with us your insights on your paper. Before we say thank you to you, did you have anything you wanted to say or anything to add to the discussion before we close out?
I think it's great that you have such a big class that wants to study empirical software engineering. That's awesome.
And they didn't drop.
That's quite a treasure. So my best to all of you. Good luck. Go out there and research and discover more stuff. And if you think you have a research question that is amenable to war stories, go at it. Have a try. It's a lot of fun. War stories, collecting war stories is a lot of fun.
You know what?
Analyzing them, not so much, but collecting them is a lot of fun.
So I'm totally sold on it, actually. I want to try it now myself. So, you know, I'd heard of the method, but not read a lot about it. So you've inspired me to use it. And perhaps also some of the students in the class will be using it as well. So Caroline, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today and answer questions on your paper. And you're very welcome to stay around for as long as you'd like. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.